Hello and welcome back to another episode. You may call it a surprise episode after how long it has been since the previous one, but another episode of our review of the Gospel Topics Essays. This one's a fun one, but before we get into today's topic, Anthony and Bill are my hosts once again. Let's throw it over to you, Anthony Miller. How are you doing, my friend?
You know, I am making it through this strange time that we're in. I worked from home for a couple months. Gave me too much time to listen to podcasts and read books, but it's been fun. And it's been nice to be an empty nester while being quarantined too.
Oh, Bill and I think I have it worse when it comes to that. We are not, our nest is full and the beaks are open for the eating. But for those traveling from the future, we are sitting on June 10th, 2020. So we're in the middle of COVID, middle of some big political unrest in the country as well, which is not kind of the topic today, but we're not going to relate the two. But we're also joined here by Bill Reel. Bill, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'll tell you, man, just to report back on everything that's going on, not to get too far off track, but as I've watched some of the political rhetoric going on, it's actually made me think about this topic we're about to go into, because Brigham Young, being kind of deeply aware of his authority and being in charge, shares a lot of rhetoric that we're going to go into in a bit. And I'm seeing some of that kind of play out in the present moment too. It is interesting to watch history to some extent kind of repeat itself at times, at least in some ways.
Yeah,
but life is good.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad that things are good for you down south in southern Utah. Yeah. Anthony, remind everybody where you're recording from again. Montana, right? That's where you're coming from? I think his audio cut out real quick.
Oh, my audio cut out. All right, so catch me up.
Yeah, just Bill is in southern Utah, and just remind everybody where you're coming from.
I'm coming from Billings, Montana, and Bill was starting to talk about what's happening with regard to violence and law enforcement and so forth, and I agree that some of what we'll read today is relevant to that, of having a culture of authoritarianism and kind of a problem with regard to how people get marginalized. And I think as the listener goes through this essay with us, they might see some parallels of some of the things that are going on today with what happened in the past.
Yeah, thank you. Bill also mentioned, and I think you were not able to hear him, but he called attention to your abrasive manner on Facebook and how that is not contributing to peace within the social sphere of this unrest of political climate. If anyone
I wish
knows
he
Anthony
could do it more
knows,
like me. I wish he could be more like me, more gentle.
Calm down a little bit, Anthony.
Yeah. I think one of Bill's problems is that he's really good at sarcasm, but people don't get it when he's being sarcastic.
And I think one of my problems is that I completely fabricated everything that I just said because Bill didn't say anything.
Okay. Well, it still fit.
No, yeah, I think that this leads into our topic pretty well, because for those that maybe haven't heard any of the previous episodes, our purpose on these episodes is to read the essay for what it is, just word for word. You will hear every word that is written in the essay now. And we want to have three reasonable voices that have really pondered hard and read and studied a lot with these topics, some more than others, and on different topics. You'll hear today, I'll be completely upfront. I'm probably the least prepared for this conversation, but I'm really looking forward to responding and reacting to some of the research that Bill has done and Anthony has put into this regard. But what we want to do is really take as objective approach as possible and identify the things in the essay that both speak well to the situation and the history and the historical record, and those that maybe are flowery painted. I'll just say flowery painted. But we do want to let the essay speak for itself and respond to it. So I think what we'll do now is we will get started. We'll get started in reading the essay. And Bill and Anthony, if you have something that you would love to add, just jump in and interrupt me, and I'll call on you as well as we go. So pretty familiar format from, if you recall what Elders Quorum used to be like for the three of us. So Anthony, how about you read this first paragraph, the overview?
Sure. So this is the Peace and Violence Among 19th Century Latter-day Saints essay, and it was released on on May 12th, 2014. So it wasn't one of the very first essays released in 2013, but it was shortly thereafter. And so anyway, I thought it was interesting. It's interesting to look at the order that they go through things. Another thing, as we get into this, as we kind of mentioned in some of the other episodes, is John Delan and a few other people did a pretty extensive study as to why otherwise active, believing, faithful members lose faith and end up either in a faith crisis or leave the church or whatnot. And that study was then put together by a number of LDS scholars, including Greg Prince and Travis Stratford and others, into a faith crisis report. And the intent of that report was for Elder Marlon Jensen, who was an emeritus general authority at the time, but he was the former church historian, to present that report to then President Uchtdorf. And that material gave a number of the top topics that led people into kind of a challenge of their faith or a reordering or a faith crisis. And most of those primary topics ended up as the essay topic. And if the listener will remember back to 2013, a couple big things happened in 2013, and one of them was President Uchtdorf's "Come Join with Us" General Conference talk, right, where in that talk he explained that there were things in our history that happened that weren't in alignment with our principles, and mistakes were made, and that when people leave the church, it's not without great thought and struggle sometimes. And then he, asked that we would doubt our doubts and then come back and join with us. So this is the context of these essays, is with the advancement of the internet and the availability of critical scholarship and history, members were finding out that what they had in Truth Restored and Our Heritage and in the priesthood and Relief Society manuals from the presidents of the church, as well as in seminary and institute courses that included church history, that a lot of our church history was very, very polished, that in some cases what was presented was misleading, either by omission or actually misleading, and that led to faith crisis, and that's what brought about these essays. So it's interesting that they chose this topic as one of the 13 gospel topic essays. And I think initially when people read this essay, they might think that the big issue is the Mountain Massacre, but there's so much more with regard to the polished history that we got in the correlated curriculum, and the disparity between that and the things that actually happened. So with that preface,
that's really good context, Anthony. It's really good context. So thanks for leading up to it.
Thank you.
One of the questions, and you can read here in a moment, but one of the questions that I have asked myself when I read the title of this essay is, why would this be one of the top 13 issues? Why would it be one of the top 13 issues? And I think is there any other part is there another answer for why this would be so concerning? Is this, I mean, you kind of answered it. It seems like where you walk through the kind of the sanitized, I'm trying not to use, some of these charged terms like whitewashed and things like that, but
polished, bowdlerized.
Bowdlerized. Yeah, this polished, a lot of the details, messy details, aren't going to be found in a polished historical telling within our heritage, et cetera. So is that why? Is the details, we just don't know them, and when you get into it, it's going to be kind of hard to learn about?
All right, so when we go through this, we're going to tease out a number of these topics that have been challenging to members as they studied them. So there's issues like blood atonement. There's issues like, as part of the endowment for quite a number of years, there was a vengeance oath that members in the temple raised their right hand and recited an oath to avenge the death of Hiram and Joseph. There were problems with, that have been challenged members with stories about the Danites, with blood atonement, with Mountain Massacre. And I think one of the purposes of this essay was to take a number of these different topics and kind of pull them into a single essay so that they could be addressed. A number of members, when they study, for example, the Extermination Order, they begin to understand that is intertwined with the Thomas Marsh story, and that he didn't leave over milk strippings. He and I think it was Orson Hyde left over violence. That the Extermination Order meant an expulsion order, and that the governor of Missouri didn't use that word extermination lightly because he was just repeating its use from Sidney Rigdon. So a number of these different kinds of issues will tease out of this essay. And my view is this essay was created in order to kind of encapsulate a number of these issues that otherwise active believing members have been challenged with as they have studied church history.
All right, let's get to it. Go ahead, Anthony.
All right, the first paragraph. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is founded on the teachings of Jesus Christ. The virtues of peace, love, and forgiveness are at the center of church doctrine and practice. Latter-day Saints believe the Savior's declaration, found in the New Testament and in the Book of Mormon, that blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. In Latter-day Saint scripture, the Lord has commanded his followers to, quote, renounce war and proclaim peace, unquote. Latter-day Saints strive to follow the counsel of the Book of Mormon prophet King Benjamin, who taught that those who are converted to the gospel of Jesus Christ, quote, will not have a mind to injure one another, but to leave peaceably, unquote.
Yeah, it seems like that paragraph's kind of setting us up to think and feel that this is what the standard has been, both in the scriptures and what the message is to the saints of this is how we should live, and kind of plant in our minds of this is how the saints have always been. Is that fair? They're trying to put us into this. The saints are peaceful state of mind as we start getting into the messy details. Bill, what do you think about that?
I think they're certainly trying to set it as the standard and the modus operandi that has been followed the majority of the time. And then they're going to make space here essentially to say, like, there's been a few occasions, just a couple of times, where we sadly haven't lived up to that. And I think you're going to notice too, as we get into this, that the word choice on the church's side is actually brilliant. They do a masterful job of choosing the right word at every moment to soften how a believer would read this and what to think, what to feel, what to perceive, so as not to be dishonest, but also to try to move people in every single way towards the direction they want the reader to be moved in. And I think they're doing it here at the beginning by saying, look, almost all the time, this is what we do. And now we're about to tell you a few times we didn't.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the Polygamy Essay as well. It kind of starts the same way. It starts with, we believe that it's man and wife, and it's one man, one wife, one husband, one wife. Now there's a few instances that's been different, and here they are. So it kind of sets you up for that standard. Now, to be fair, I agree. Let's renounce war. Let's proclaim peace. We should not have a mind to injure one another. We should live peaceably. That's awesome. And how relevant is that today? So that's great. Well, now let's get into the next paragraph. Bill, can you read despite these ideals?
Despite these ideals, early Latter-day Saints did not obtain peace easily. They were persecuted, often violently, for their beliefs. And tragically, at some points in the 19th century, most notably in the Mountain Massacre, some church members participated in deplorable violence against people they perceived to be their enemies. This essay explores both violence committed against Latter-day Saints and violence committed by them. While historical context can help shed light on these acts of violence, it does not excuse them. And I want to just say two things here. The first one, when they say some church members participated in deplorable violence, I want to just highlight that word some. This is one of those moments where they're trying to give the reader the idea that it was just a few members. Yet, in an effort to be transparent, the some would include the prophet Joseph Smith, President Brigham Young, Hosea Stout, John D. Lee, Porter Rockwell, the Danites, Bill Hickman, and hundreds of other influential early members and leaders, and even a few more in modern times. One that comes to mind is Boyd K. Packer talking about punching or assaulting a LGBT individual who makes any kind of flirtatious advance to a missionary while serving. And then I also want to say a positive thing, which is as I get to the end of this, they acknowledge that just because the historical context is important and helps us understand these issues, it doesn't excuse them. And I think that's great on the church's part to make that comment here in this message as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I'm glad that they put that in there. I'll read the next paragraph here. So religious. Wait. Sorry, Anthony, you've got something to say.
It's just like Elders Quorum. I'm going to jump in. So I would go back to this idea that I think the dominant narrative, using Richard Bushman's words, the dominant narrative is that Latter-day Saints were generally peaceable. They were persecuted for their beliefs. They worked maybe to defend themselves, but they really weren't aggressors. And I think what the transition of these paragraphs are starting to reveal is that absolutely is not a complete narrative. It's very polished. Latter-day Saints, including leaders, committed heinous acts of violence. The persecution that the church received wasn't just because of their beliefs. It was much more complicated than that. And in any event, I wanted to point that part out.
Yeah, no, that's important. And there's specific examples of exactly that as we get into these details. So next paragraph, it touches me. It's my turn. Religious persecution in the 1830s and 1840s. In the first 2 decades after the church was organized, Latter-day Saints were often the victims of violence. Soon after Joseph Smith organized the church in New York in 1830, he and other church members began settling in areas to the west, in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. Time and again, the Saints tried to build their Zion community where they could worship God and live in peace, and repeatedly they saw their hopes dashed through forcible and violent removal. Mobs drove them from Jackson County, Missouri in 1833, from the state of Missouri in 1839, after the governor of the state issued an order in late October 1838 that the Mormons be expelled from the state or, quote, exterminated, end quote, and from their city of Nauvoo, Illinois in 1846. Following their expulsion from Nauvoo, Latter-day Saints made the difficult trek across the Great Plains to Utah. So there's some things to unpack in this one right here. So Bill, there's that term that the first little flicker of light in my head came in that first sentence where it says the Saints were often the victims of violence. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so at times they were victims of violence. We'll talk, I think, somewhere along the way, probably about Hans Mill. I think that's a great example of violence being perpetuated against the Saints. But it fails to acknowledge the complexity that much of the violence perpetuated against Joseph Smith and the early members was often due to President Smith's rhetoric, his politics, his polygamous practices involving teenage brides and other men's wives, and at times him using his leadership in the church to get himself out of legal troubles. There were times where he would be arrested on real charges, but because they were in heavily Mormon areas, he was able to manipulate the situation and such to get himself out of the legal trouble.
Yeah, thank you. Anthony, you made mention of this extermination order. First of all, let's talk about this term exterminated. Does extermination, what does that term mean? Because you kind of alluded to it previously.
Yeah, so in October of 1838, by then, there was the Mormon-Missouri War, and the Mormons were ransacking towns, kidnapping people, burning them to the ground, stealing things. The Missourians were responding back. So there was this back and forth kind of thing going on. And so before October 1838, Sidney Rigdon, who was in the first presidency of the church, gave a sermon called the Salt Sermon. It was on July 4th, actually. So it was months before 1838 and
October,
before October. And so I won't read all of it, just in interest in time, but there's a portion of that sermon where Sidney Rigdon says, we take God and all the holy angels to witness this day that we warn all men in the name of Jesus Christ to come on us no more forever. The men or set of men that attempts it does so at the expense of their lives. And the mob that comes to disturb, and the mob that comes to on us to disturb us, and then this is the money quote right here, it shall be between us and them a war of extermination, for we will follow them till the last drop of blood is spilled, or else they will have to exterminate us. For we will carry the seat of war to their own houses and their own families, and one part or another shall be utterly destroyed. So the word extermination was used by Sidney Rigdon here on July 4th, months before October of that year. And what was expressed by extermination is, from the quote that I read, is that the Mormons would basically commit genocide to the last drop of blood, not just of the men who fought the Mormons, but to go to their own houses and their own families until they're utterly destroyed. So that's a member of the first presidency of the church using that verbiage. The extermination order from Governor Boggs was an expulsion order. It was we got to get rid of the Mormons because they're just totally out of control. It's like mob violence and this fighting back and forth between the Missourians and the Mormons. And so the word extermination was used to directly respond to Sidney Rigdon's talk. It meant expulsion. Now, some apologists would say, well, it also means extermination because if the Mormons didn't leave, they had license to kill them. But again, this is a response to Sidney Rigdon indicating that to every last drop of blood, we're going to kill you and your families and come to your homes.
Go ahead, Bill.
I was a convert to the church, and I remember all of those early lessons about this topic. And I remember that we, as Mormons, told each other that, hey, we were heavily persecuted, and there was no good reason for it. And here's this mean governor, this mean, nasty guy who wants to just kill us. And look, he uses the word exterminate. He wants us dead. And we Latter-day Saints were all left to believe that narrative. That's the story that comes across as Anthony said, the dominant narrative in the correlated curriculum. And we ought to recognize right here at the start that even the word exterminate, we twisted it into one meaning when the reality is that Governor Boggs meant it in a certain specific way. Yes, get rid of, but get rid of as in remove from the state. Get them out of here. Move them to somewhere else. In no way, shape, or form is he, at least not blatantly or directly, asking anybody to kill the Mormons. He's asking them to kick them out. And so right from the start, the way we use rhetoric in the correlated curriculum in our lessons on Sundays is meant to create a certain interpretation in the minds of members. And that interpretation is often less than fully accurate and less than fully transparent.
Yeah, I mean, it's a charged term, but it leads me to think of that term persecution complex of everything is always unrighteously placed onto us and we had no responsibility for it. And that really sets you up, especially in this essay where it doesn't talk about Sidney Rigdon's July 4th oration, the Salt Sermon, because then when you learn about it, you go, oh my goodness, this was really difficult for me. My faith crisis happened in the middle of Sunday school being on Church History 2017. And when we talked about these things and I had been learning about all this, my hand was popping up and saying like, no. And the pushback I got, I kind of learned firsthand how difficult it was going to be understood. as someone that was trying earnestly to understand the actual history of the church, that wasn't welcomed in Sunday school. It wasn't welcomed. Now, one other thing before we move on to the next paragraph, and I'll just read the next one as well. But this, the July 4th oration, don't write it off as Sidney Rigdon getting emotional and piping up from the pulpit, and that Joseph has no ties to it. It doesn't look like historically that Joseph was present. However, Sidney Rigdon was a member of the First Presidency, and it was published, signed by the First Presidency later on in the Millennial Star. Am I mistaken by the name of that publication? I might be. It might be Times and Seasons. I can't remember where it was published, but it was published soon thereafter that it was given. So this wasn't a rogue Sidney Rigdon. This was endorsed by the entire First Presidency, which includes Joseph Smith. Okay, let's read this next paragraph, and I'll go ahead and read it. As Latter-day Saints faced these difficulties, they sought to live by revelations to Joseph Smith that counseled them to live their religion in peace with their neighbors. Nevertheless, their adversaries in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois resented the saints' differing religious beliefs and social and economic practices. They also felt threatened by the saints' growing numbers, which meant that Mormons could increasingly control local elections. These opponents attacked the saints first verbally and then physically. Church leaders, including Joseph Smith, were tarred and feathered, beaten, and unjustly imprisoned. Other members of the church were also the victims of violent crimes. In the most famous incident, at least 17 men and boys ranging from 9 to 78 were slaughtered in the Hans Mill Massacre. Some Latter-day Saint women were raped and otherwise sexually assaulted during the Missouri persecutions. Vigilantes and mobs destroyed homes and stole property. Many of the saints' opponents enriched themselves with land and property that was not justly theirs. Okay, hold on. I'm supposed to be the soft voice of reason. This paragraph is really hard to read. This is so one-sided, and I'm sorry if I'm now kind of taking my reasonable voice T-shirt off. This is hard. This is really hard to read. That can someone? I can't even put it into words. Can someone jump in and help describe why this is so tough?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I have a couple ideas. First of all, it might be early, but at some point, I need to highly recommend Ben Park's book, Kingdom of Nauvoo. And I know that we're talking about Missouri, Ohio, and Illinois here, but in his book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, Ben Park, an LDS scholar, explains how the Council of 50 worked and how the Mormons were making a plot basically to overthrow the U.S. democracy, government, and constitution and replace it with a theocracy. So that kind of underlying tone was going on. For those who study the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Mormon, it explains that in the latter days that the righteous Gentiles would unite with the seed of the Lamanites, and they would destroy the unrighteous Gentiles. And so that was part of the narrative of what was going on as well. And so the Latter-day Saints felt emboldened at this time to fight, and they felt like the Lord was on their side. Kind of like when you read the Old Testament, the narratives are God would be okay with genocide and taking people out and so forth, because the Jews wrote that history with God on their side. The Latter-day Saints also had those kinds of things, and it carried over into Nauvoo with the Council of 50 and with Joseph running for president. So those things were going on. It also doesn't explain here. I guess it does a little bit because it says the vigilantes and mobs destroyed homes and property. That were some Latter-day Saint people that did that, as well as Missourians that did that. And Hans Mill really was not some random thing. It was a retaliation or a response to the Danites, which included Mormons. They were all Mormons. Earlier at the Battle of Crooked River, where Missourians were attacked and killed as well. And so it was kind of a tit for tat, back and forth fight. And the Mormons, were fighting, and it's understandable that they're fighting, right? And they were committing atrocities And the context is, it's understandable that they were committing atrocities too. Like, it was a war. But the big problem I think that a lot of members experience is that as they study this history, it's so incredibly different from the polished narratives that we were given as members of the church, that Mormons were innocent. There might have been a few rowdy people. There might have been some people named the Danites, but they were off the rails, that they didn't really represent members of the church. The leaders really didn't know what they were doing, and that Hans Mill was purely about religious persecution. And that is just simply dishonest. So anyway, that's what I have to say about that paragraph.
Yeah, I would only add the first little sentence there, Allan. As Latter-day Saints faced these difficulties, they sought to live by the revelations to Joseph Smith that counseled them to live their religion in peace with their neighbors. That's sometimes Joseph Smith said nice things. Sometimes Joseph Smith didn't say nice things. Sometimes the church leadership asked the members to live in peace with their neighbors. And sometimes they gave permission for violence and use violent rhetoric. We have to stop thinking in binary ways, in black and white ways. We have to recognize that all humans are complicated creatures, and that often we are often saying and teaching and thinking and wrestling with contradictive thoughts inside our head, and sometimes those express themselves through our mouth. And that we ought to be crystal clear here that while the paragraph is trying to say that Joseph Smith taught peace, he did that sometimes, and sometimes he taught something else.
Yeah, and we've said this a few times. We'll probably say it a few more. I think it's important to every so often, as we're talking about these things, to make it explicitly clear that our position, at least I'll speak for me, my position is not that the Missourians were justified in their actions. It's not that the LDS folks were justified in their actions. It's that both sides committed atrocities and both sides resorted to violence where it should not have gone to that level. It's not an us versus them, and that goes both ways. It shouldn't be the Missourians were all good and all peaceful, and it was the LDS people that incited this violence. This is a complicated issue, so I just want to make sure that we call attention to that.
Both sides contributed to the perpetuation of the escalation of violence.
Well put. Bill, could you read this next paragraph? The expulsion from Missouri.
The expulsion from Missouri, involving at least 8,000 Latter-day Saints, occurred during the winter months, heightening the suffering of the thousands of refugees who lacked adequate food and shelter and were sometimes subject to epidemic diseases. In March 1839, when Joseph Smith, imprisoned in Liberty, Missouri, received reports of the suffering of the exiled Latter-day Saints, he exclaimed, "O God, where art thou?" and prayed, "Remember thy suffering saints, O our God."
Any thoughts there, gentlemen? If not, we can move on to the next one.
Okay.
Anthony, why don't you read this next paragraph?
Sure. After being driven from Missouri, the Saints were initially welcomed by the people of the neighboring state of Illinois and found peace for a time in Nauvoo. Ultimately, however, conflict arose again as non-Mormons and dissenters from the church renewed their attacks. Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were brutally martyred by a mob in an Illinois prison, despite the promise of the state's governor that the brothers would be protected while in custody. 18 years later, beginning in the cold winter month of February 1846, the main body of the Saints left Nauvoo under tremendous pressure. They settled in temporary camps, what would now be called refugee camps, on the plains of Iowa and Nebraska. An estimated 1 in 12 Saints died in these camps during the first year. Some of the elderly and poor initially remained in Nauvoo and hoped to join the main body of the Saints later, but a mob forcibly expelled them from Nauvoo in September 1846 and then desecrated the temple. One non-Mormon who passed through the Saints' camps shortly thereafter wrote, "Cowed and cramped by cold and sunburn, alternating as each weary day and night dragged on, they were, almost all of them, the crippled victims of disease. They could not satisfy the feeble cravings of their sick. They had not bread to quiet the fractious hunger cries of their children. The scope of this violence against a religious group was unprecedented in the history of the United States." So there's just so much there. I mean, the listener really should read or get on Audible the Kingdom of Nauvoo book that I mentioned before from Benjamin Park. It explains so much more context of what was happening here. This makes it sound like the martyrdom it omits so much of what was happening with the martyrdom, what was happening with Masonry, what was happening with polygamy, what was happening with the Nauvoo expositor, why there were dissenters from among the leadership who left. It doesn't explain what was going on with the Council of 50. It doesn't explain the succession crisis and how many members of the saints didn't follow Brigham Young, including Emma. She and others of the Smith family did not follow Brigham Young. There's so much more complexity than what's provided here. This, to me, seems like trying to carefully parse language that supports some of the dominant narrative that we've received, but it still seems to intentionally omit many of the other problems that are happening here. At this point, I would mention that this wasn't one of the first essays that I read. By the time I had read some of the other essays and I perceived that there was some spin and polished, even dishonesty, misrepresentation, and omissions in the other essays, as I read this essay, I searched on Wikipedia and I pulled up the Mormonism and Violence page where it goes through and it gives names to some of these conflicts. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but just recommend to the listener that you spend some time on the Mormonism and Violence page on Wikipedia. And also by this stage, I was searching for reviews of the essays and I found, the review on Mormon Think as well. So I'd suggest those to the listener.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Allan.
I wanted to just call attention to one thing. I made a note to say this a little bit later, but it certainly applies here. So one thing that I've been thinking about over the last week, I was listening to Bryce Blankenegle's serial Mormon podcast, Naked Mormonism, and he's almost to the martyrdom. And one thing that, as I was listening to that about a week ago, I think I texted you about it, Bill, was where did the persecution go after Brigham and his group of saints left? Because I don't read much about the saints that stayed, Emma and others. I don't read much about the persecution that stayed there. It seems that those that were practicing polygamy secretly, which is against the law, doing a lot of this other land speculation and those types of things, that the persecution stopped when those practices stopped. And I can hear my kind of believing voice say, well, Satan had won. There was no reason for him to persecute those that stayed behind because they didn't follow the true church. But that doesn't track for me because you have leaders like James Strang who did stay. He ended up leaving Nauvoo, but persecution followed him because after he had started his own branch of Mormonism, he adopted polygamy and some of the less enviable practices of Joseph Smith, and not just Joseph Smith, but just other less enviable practices. And he ended up being assassinated, martyred, if you want to use the martyred or murdered term. So the persecution wasn't with the true church in that case, if you are a believing Brigham Latter-day Saint. So for me, it's just very interesting that once these practices, it's very telling that once these practices stopped and left to go across the plains, the persecution largely stopped as well.
I think it's a great point, right? Like the saints that stayed behind, Emma had some positive standing in her community. Other saints continued to run businesses and to have homes and to be unmolested, as the term back then was used. I think it's also important to note it feels as though this paragraph wants to skip over the transition from Joseph Smith to Brigham. And as Anthony pointed out, this comment that only the elderly and the infirm stayed behind negates the violence that happened in that transition. And we'll get to some of that later when we talk about the Whistling Whittlers and William Marks, who is the president of the Nauvoo High Council. If we go back, and again, this is maybe not the reference we want, but if people go back and listen to Radio Free Mormon, who I think is the only guy who's really done this expose on that transition, at least as well and as deep as I think anybody has done, you'll realize that when it comes to who had authority and who didn't, who should have been in charge and who shouldn't, that the Quorum of the 12, led by Brigham Young, in some ways overstepped their bounds to take control of the church. And in that transition was lots of violent rhetoric. The saints that did not want to follow Brigham stayed behind, and there were a lot of them, and they weren't just the elderly and the infirm. And again, just pointing out that we tell kind of a partial story, and when we tell a partial story, as the Gospel Principles book points out, that's also a level of lying and dishonesty.
Great point. All right. Being conscious of time, let's move on to the next one. Are we on church leaders and members?
Yes.
Okay. I'll go ahead and read that. Church leaders and members repeatedly attempted to gain redress from local and state governments. When these petitions failed, they appealed unsuccessfully to the federal government to correct past wrongs and gain future protection. Latter-day Saints long remembered the persecutions they experienced and the unwillingness of government authorities either to protect them or to prosecute their attackers. They often lamented that they experienced religious persecution in a land that promised religious freedom. In the face of this extended persecution, some of the saints, beginning in 1838, responded on some occasion with defensive and at times retaliatory actions of their own. It feels like a big setup to excuse some actions here. But Bill, what are your thoughts on that last part of that paragraph?
Just the simple idea that the story the church is trying to perpetuate here is that the saints are only responding, and sometimes they would get defensive and sometimes they would retaliate. But it's always because these mean people around them are always persecuting them, and they're only doing it after they've had enough, after they've met their limit. And the reality is it ignores the fact that some of the violence originated with the saints. The Nauvoo Expositor, I think, is a great example. People have claimed that newspaper, when it was started, I think it was originally started by William Law, if I'm not mistaken, was told to contain lots of lies and dishonesty about the saints. And the reality is now that we can all go back and read that first edition, and I think that's all that ever got printed was that first edition, that it was completely full of truth in terms of what the church was doing and what its leadership was advocating. A lot of this violence originated with the saints. Not all of it, maybe not even exactly half of it, but certainly a significant portion of it did.
Yeah, and I'd say some of the polish here is, in these paragraphs that we just went through, they're just kind of jumping back and forth in time. Like the last paragraph that we read in talking about 1838, but then we just came from 1846. So they're talking about a pretty extended period of time and a lot of things that happened during that period of time. And I think we lose some of the context by jumping back and forth in time, or I think the essay does. And that's why, again, I'd go back to highly recommend to the reader Ben Park's book and some of the other books that chronologically follow these things over time and put them in context and in chronological order.
Anthony, could you read this heading and the next paragraph?
Yes. Violence and vigilantism in the 19th century United States. In 19th century American society, community violence was common and often condoned. Much of the violence perpetrated by and against Latter-day Saints fell within the then existing American tradition of extra-legal vigilantism, in which citizens organized to take justice into their own hands when they believed government was either oppressive or lacking. Vigilantes generally targeted minority groups or those perceived to be criminal or socially marginal. Such acts were at times fueled by religious rhetoric.
Go ahead and read the next paragraph too. It's actually just finish this section. It's a pretty short section, and then
Sure.
we can get thoughts.
The existence of community-based militias also contributed to this culture of vigilantism. Congress passed a law in 1792 requiring every able-bodied male between 18 and 45 years of age to belong to a community militia. Over time, the militias turned into the National Guard. But in early America, they were often unruly, perpetrating acts of violence against individuals or groups perceived to be opponents of the community. In the 1830s and 1840s, the Latter-day Saints communities in Ohio, Missouri, Illinois, and Utah were all located in the western frontier regions of the United States, where community violence was readily sanctioned.
Bill, you've got some good historical context here with some of these notes that you've made. Can you walk us through those?
Yeah, I think this is the place we have to stop for a few minutes and talk about this religious rhetoric. So let me start off by saying that those who defend the church, apologists and others, try to make the argument that Brigham is just using this rhetoric to build loyalty among the saints, and that he doesn't actually intend violence. And so I would ask that the listeners to this podcast listen as these quotes are read. And I just want to read a few of them and ask yourself if Brigham really is giving permission to the saints to use violence, or if he's just using some rhetorical device to do something else. And again, I think the goal here for the three of us and others who have participated in these conversations, as we've started from the beginning, yeah, we all have biases, but to be as fair as possible, to acknowledge where the church does good things, and to draw attention to where it's not being fully honest. The first one, so here's the quote. There are sins that men commit for which they cannot receive forgiveness in this world or in that which is to come. And if they had their eyes open to see their true condition, would be perfectly willing to have their blood spilt upon the ground, that the smoke thereof might ascend to heaven as an offering for their sins, and the smoking incense would atone for their sins. He says, I know when you hear my brethren telling about cutting people off from the earth that you consider it is strong doctrine, but it is to save them, not to destroy them. I know there are transgressors who, if they knew themselves in the only condition upon which they can obtain forgiveness, would beg of their brethren to shed their blood. So he goes into kind of the same rhetoric again. So this is Journal of Discourses. This is volume 4, pages 53 to 54. He says here, there are sins that can be atoned for by an offering upon an altar, as in ancient days. And there are sins that the blood of a lamb or a calf or of turtle doves cannot remit, but they must be atoned for by the blood of the man. That is the reason why men talk to you as they do from this stand. They understand the doctrine and throw out a few words about it. In other words, there's been a lot of things said in private among the leadership that's not being said, and here we are giving you an inkling of what that is that we're discussing, right? So he says, you have been taught that doctrine, but you do not understand it. So that's one.
Before you move on, can I talk about that real quick?
Please.
Yeah, so I mean, this idea of this blood atonement, which certainly applies to the topic of violence here, I mean, it goes on to live in the LDS and Utah culture for a long time. It goes on to be mentioned in Mormon doctrine. If you look at, I mean, you go ahead and Google the last execution by firing squad in the United States. And this is a heavy topic, obviously, but there's a reason why Utah was the last state to use the firing squad. Because what happens when someone gets shot? Their blood is spilled on the ground. The last execution by firing squad was in Utah in 2010. That was the last execution by firing squad. That's an uncomfortable truth that is kind of the, Carolyn Pearson has that book of The Ghost of Polygamy. This is the ghost of blood atonement. It lives on in the psyche in many ways, all the way to current days. That's all I wanted to add, Bill.
Gotcha. Yeah. So can I jump in for a minute? So I'm going to share 2 paragraphs from the Wikipedia page on Mormonism and violence, so the listener can also have additional context. So with regard to blood oaths, it reads, historically, Mormon ritual provided an example in which capital punishment is contemplated, though not necessarily required, for violations of historical blood oaths in the endowment ritual. The blood oaths in the ceremony were related to protecting the ritual's secrecy. Participants made an oath that rather than ever revealing the secret gestures of the ceremony, they would rather have, quote, my throat be cut from ear to ear and my tongue torn out from its roots, unquote. And, quote, our breasts be torn open, our hearts and vitals be torn out and given to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, unquote. Next, quote, your body be cut asunder and all your bowels gush out, unquote, showing an entire refusal to accept promises made in the washing and the anointing ordinance. This is from the Berger book on the endowment. They were changed to reference to different ways in which life might be taken. The entire penalty portion of the ceremony was removed by the LDS Church in 1990, although I would add that the remnants of it still remain. The method of execution isn't fully pantomimed anymore, but there's still remnants there. And during its lifetime, there is no documented instance in which a person has been killed for violating the oaths of secrecy. But this was, this is me speaking now, this was part of the cultural experience of Mormonism in terms of violence. And then I mentioned earlier in the episode, the law of vengeance. After the death of Joseph Smith, this is from Wikipedia again, after the death of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young added an oath of vengeance to the Nauvoo endowment ritual. Participants in the ritual made an oath to pray that God would, quote, avenge the blood of the prophets on this nation, unquote. Quote, the prophets, unquote, were Joseph and Hiram Smith, and this nation was the United States. The oath was removed from the ceremony not until the 1920s. In 1877, Young noted that he viewed as a similarity between Smith's death and blood atonement doctrine, in that whether we believe in blood atonement or not, Smith and the other prophets sealed their testimony with their blood. So when we talk about violence and the saints, we need to understand that this was part of the theological framework. As I mentioned before, the Book of Mormon prophesies the righteous Gentiles uniting with the Lamanites and overthrowing the evil Gentiles. And then when you add that, with the other conference talks and other kinds of teachings with the blood oaths of the temple and the oath of the law of vengeance that lasted from Nauvoo all the way to the 1920s, violence was an underlying theme of Mormon theology and ritual.
Yeah. So we shared the one quote there from Brigham. Here's another one. All mankind love themselves, and let these principles be known by an individual, and he would be glad to have his blood shed. That would be loving themselves, even unto eternal salvation. Will you love your brothers and sisters likewise, when they have committed a sin that cannot be atoned for without the shedding of their blood? Will you love that man or woman well enough to shed their blood? And now here's the money quote out of this one. I could refer you to plenty of instances where men have been righteously slain in order to atone for their sins. I have seen scores and hundreds of people for whom there would have been a chance in the last resurrection. So it would have been a chance, and it says in the last resurrection there will be, if their lives had been taken and their blood spilled on the ground as a smoking incense to the Almighty, but who are now angels to the devil. I mean, that's pretty strong. For that to be a rhetorical device, to me, seems insane. He continues, he says, this is loving our neighbor as ourselves. If he needs help, help him. If he wants salvation and it is necessary to spill his blood on the earth in order that he may be saved, spill it. Any of you who understand the principles of eternity, if you have sinned a sin requiring the shedding of blood, except the sin unto death, would not be satisfied nor rest. Here's another one. David Whitmer, one of the three witnesses to the Book of Mormon, revealed the following concerning the Danites. In the spring of 1838, the heads of the church and many of the members had gone deep into error and blindness. In June 1838, at Far West, Missouri, a secret organization was formed, Dr. Avard being put in as the leader of the band. A certain oath was to be administered to all the brethren to bind them to support the heads of the church in everything they should teach. All who refused to take this oath were considered dissenters from the church, and certain things were to be done concerning these dissenters. So either take the oath or face retribution. So you're either in or you're out. By Dr. Avard's secret band, my persecutions for trying to show them their errors became of such nature that I had to leave the Latter-day Saints. So here Whitmer tells us why he left. He didn't just apostatize and run away because the church was too hard. He ran off because he felt like his life was in danger, because he wouldn't make these oaths to hurt people in order to perpetuate the church. Another one here. It was only after we had made a careful study of Mormon history that we became convinced that the Hickman's confessions could not be easily dismissed. This is Mormon Frontier, On the Mormon Frontier, the Diary of Hosea Stout. By the way, Hosea Stout is a fascinating character in Mormon history, full of violence. He is probably at the center of almost all of this violence he's involved with. I think it's because of his loyalty to church leaders and his willingness to keep things confidential. So the authors here say that we became convinced that Hickman's confessions could not be easily dismissed. We found, for instance, that John B. Lee, who had been a member of the church's secret Council of 50, charged that Mormon police committed murders for the church, and that under Brigham Young, Hosea Stout was chief of police. Hosea Stout was a member of the Danite Band and later served as a bodyguard for Joseph Smith. Besides serving as chief of police in Nauvoo, he was an officer in the Nauvoo Legion. Fortunately, Hosea Stout's diary has survived and proves to be one of the most revealing documents that we have had access to. The fact that it was written by a faithful Mormon makes it even more significant. In his diary, Stout frankly tells of some of the violent methods used by Mormon leaders. And so for one instance, under the date of April 3rd, 1845, Hosea Stout records the following. In the morning, I went to the temple and was roughly accosted by brothers Cahoon and Cutler about the circumstance which took place last night at the temple. They said that the old police had beat a man almost to death in the temple, to which I replied I was glad of it, and that I had given orders to that effect in case anyone should be found in the temple after night, and they had only done as they were told or ordered. We concluded to lay the matter before President Brigham Young and get his advice. Brother Brigham came to us, and we related the matter to him, and he approved of the proceedings of the police and said he wanted us to still guard the temple, to regulate matters there, which was done to our satisfaction and justification. Under the date of January 9th, 1846, Hosea Stout records, when we came to the temple, somewhat a considerable number of the guard were assembled. Among them was William Hibbard. He had evidently come as a spy. When I saw him, I told Scott that we must bounce a stone off of his head, to which he agreed, and we prepared accordingly. I got an opportunity to hit him on the back of his head, which came very near taking his life, but few knew anything about what was the matter. He left the ground out of his senses, and when he came to himself, he could not tell what happened to him. Other entries in Hosea Stout's diary show that he was a very brutal man, and again, operated with the permission of leaders. I just would impose here, don't think for a second that he's doing this in a vacuum by himself. He has their permission, and they certainly are aware of these things going on. He is in the leadership councils of the church in various areas, chief of police, council of 50. He's directly doing what the leaders are asking him to do. Hickman, and again, I don't want to take up a ton of time, but I think these are crucial to understanding the rhetoric. Hickman confessed that he had committed murders, which had been ordered by President Brigham Young and Apostle Orson Hyde. In the Mormonism, Shadow or Reality, this is Sandra and Gerald Tanner. They're very well known in the label as anti-Mormons. On pages 444 and 447 of that book, they give evidence that Bill Hickman robbed and murdered the enemies of the church, and that he had approval and protection of Mormon leaders in carrying out his crimes. That the Mormon leaders approved of Hickman's crimes is clear from the Journal of John Benyon. In 1860, Benyon felt that Hickman and his brother George Hickman should be punished for their evil deeds, but he soon learned that Bishop Gardner had been bound and could not act, and that Orson Hyde, president of the 12 Apostles, taught that a man should not be punished for stealing from the Gentiles. This is the following from Benyon's journal. Saturday 13th, went to the city, met Bishop Gardner, had a talk with him about W.A. Hickman's wicked course. For some time past, he said up till now he had been bound and could not act. I told him I was not bound, neither was I afraid to expose the wickedness of any man, that it was my duty to expose. We got home about sundown in the evening. I met with bishop and counselors and parties concerned to try George Hickman for stealing mules. When about to commence trial, Elder Hyde came in, and by Bishop Gardner's solicitation, he preached, and the trial was postponed after meeting Bishop's counsel, and Elder Hyde had a long talk in my house. Brother Hyde said, speaking of stealing, that a man may steal and be influenced by the Spirit of the Lord to do it, that Hickman had done it years past, and that he never would institute a trial against a brother for stealing from the Gentiles, but stealing from his brethren. He was down on it, and he laid down much teaching on the subject. So here you have blatant permission to steal and abuse non-members. Again, there's tons of these. D. Michael Quinn has called out a culture of violence, that those who were apostates or even faithful Mormons who had committed sins were worthy of death. That was the rhetoric in Mormonism at the time. These quotes go on and on. There are dozens and dozens of these. That's just me sharing a few of them. I guess that probably is sufficient, I think, to at least set the tone. If people want to read, there's plenty of places to look to read all of these quotes. Mormon Think, I think, is one of those where those quotes are all kind of just listed out.
Yeah, so I'd share, as I was reading this essay, then my experience was, I recognized that we got a polished narrative, even in, institute classes, much more polished even in Sunday school classes, Our Heritage, Truth Restored, and so forth. But then the other thing that I'm reading through this is, some of the other dominant narratives that we have in the church are things like, if you go to church, if you yell at your kids before you go to church on Sunday, maybe you shouldn't take the sacrament that day because there's contention in you, or if you got in a fight with your spouse or something, or if you were angry at somebody, maybe you should abstain from participating in an ordinance or going to the temple or something like that until you've worked through that kind of contention. And as I'm reading through this essay, I'm thinking what was experienced in the past by those who were participating in ordinances, by those who were leaders of the church, was so disparate from the dominant narrative. And it makes sense. Like, if the apologist says, the history is like a foreign country, like they thought differently, they did things differently. Like I totally accept that. But my experience as an active believing member reading through this essay, I was experiencing some dissonance because this is so far departed from the narratives that we received.
Right. And just two other things. You mentioned earlier the temple vengeance oath. That probably should be mentioned here. This was used in the LDS temple ceremony. You and each of you do covenant and promise that you will pray and never cease to pray Almighty God to avenge the blood of the prophets upon this nation, that you will teach the same to your children and your children's children unto the third and fourth generations. It should also be noted that President Brigham Young went even further, sometimes in his private language. Meeting with the Council of 50 in March of 1849, he said, quote, when speaking about apostates and those who are running up against the saints, I want their cursed heads cut off that they may atone for their sins, is his exact quote. His interpretation of blood atonement evoked the saints' vision of themselves as an Old Testament people, an identification so strong that the plans for the Salt Lake Temple included an altar to offer sacrifices. The gory details of blood atonement shock modern observers, but the common experience of butchering animals made them less repellent to that doctrine. Brigham Young advocated violence. He advocated taking apostates, even faithful members who had committed serious sins, and certainly the enemies of the church, and authorized, advocated, and encouraged violence against those groups.
And like I mentioned before, that vengeance oath was part of the endowment experience until the 1920s. So this wasn't just mid 1800s thing. Like it perpetuated all the way into the 1920s.
Yeah, I thought that it was removed in 1935. The listener can fact check us if you'd like, but I thought it was until 1935, and the way that it was worded was this should be taught to the third and fourth generation. And I did the math, and my ancestors, my great grandparents, which are definitely within 3 and 4 generations, would have been taught this, which means I should have been taught it by them. So it's the wording's a bit tricky.
Yeah, it is.
I'll read this next section. There's a few paragraphs, so I'll be reading for a minute, but then we can get some comments here. So we're going back to Missouri, gentlemen. The Mormon-Missouri War and the Danites. The isolated acts of violence committed by some Latter-day Saints can generally be seen as a subset of the broader phenomenon of frontier violence in 19th century America. In 1838, Joseph Smith and other church members fled from mobs in Ohio and moved to Missouri, where Latter-day Saints had already established settlements. Joseph Smith believed that opposition from the church dissidents and other antagonists had weakened and ultimately destroyed their community in Kirtland, Ohio, where only 2 years before they had completed a temple at great sacrifice. By the summer of 1838, church leaders saw the rise of similar threats to their goal of creating a harmonious community in Missouri. At the Latter-day Saint settlement of Far West, some leaders and members organized a paramilitary group known as the Danites, whose objective was to defend the community against dissident and excommunicated Latter-day Saints, as well as other Missourians. Historians generally concur that Joseph Smith approved of the Danites, but that he probably was not briefed on all their plans and likely did not sanction the full range of their activities. Danites intimidated church dissenters and other Missourians. For instance, they warned some dissenters to leave Caldwell County. During the fall of 1838, as tensions escalated during what is now known as the Mormon-Missouri War, the Danites were apparently absorbed into militias largely composed of Latter-day Saints. These militias clashed with their Missouri opponents, leading to a few fatalities on both sides. In addition, Mormon vigilantes, including many Danites, raided 2 towns believed to be centers of anti-Mormon activity, burning homes and stealing goods. Though the existence of the Danites was short-lived, it resulted in a long-standing and much embellished myth about a secret society of Mormon vigilantes. I'm going to stop there. I know that there's a little bit more, but I'm going to stop there. In this paragraph, as I read it, it does a few good things and then kind of walks back on them. It talks about, it's open about these Danites and these militias raiding towns, burning homes, and stealing goods. Then it kind of steps back from really the church leaders having any responsibility for these actions. Joseph, first of all, that middle paragraph, the middle section rather, that says historians generally concur that Joseph Smith approved of the Danites. I mean, that gives the reader the permission to hold space for, well, maybe he didn't. Maybe he didn't approve of it, because they generally concur, historians do. But he was probably not briefed. Again, that's sort of this this slippery language that doesn't want to accept the responsibility that perhaps he was briefed on some of this stuff. He probably wasn't. That's a little bit difficult language that is being used here.
You want me to jump in here for a second, Allan?
Yeah.
So I think this little note is crucial because you're right. First off, for the longest time, the dominant narrative was that the Danites were a made-up thing. They weren't real. And then suddenly the dominant narrative slowly switches over to, yeah, they may have existed, but they never really hurt anybody. And the church really didn't know what they were doing. And then now here we have this essay come out, and the church in its correlated curriculum now acknowledges that Joseph Smith, at least most historians generally concur that Joseph Smith approved of the Danites. But here's the data, which leaves us, I think, to no longer think that, well, most historians and generally concur. H. Michael Marcourt was working, and that's a believing member, by the way, faithful historian, working on a transcript of Joseph Smith's early diaries, and came across the following by Dean C. Jesse and David J. Whitaker. Those are church historians. Verified and published the following. This diary contains a very important entry under the date of July 27th, 1838, which has been crossed out. Mr. Marcourt worked carefully with this portion of the record and was finally able to decipher most of the words. He discovered that the entry related to the Danite band. It not only confirmed the existence of the band, but said it was organized for the purpose of making things right and cleansing the church. Here it is. This is the quote. And this, again, is Joseph Smith. The brethren or saints have come up hither thus far according to the order of the Danites. We have a company of Danites in these times to put right physically that which is not right, and to cleanse the church of very great evils, which has hitherto existed among us, inasmuch as they cannot be put to right by teachings and persuasions. This company, or a part of them, exhibited on the 4th day of July. They came up to consecrate by companies of 10s, commanded by their captain over 10s. While Jesse and Whitaker do not seem to catch the serious implications of their transcription, they acknowledge that there was an attempt to suppress the material in this quotation. This is their words, again, church historians. Some of the material in this citation has been crossed out in pencil in the original by the latter hand. The point here being is that president and founder of the LDS Church, Joseph Smith, helped organize the Danites, and for the purpose of making right that which could not be done out in the open. And so we ought to recognize that Joseph Smith knew about and helped organize the Danites. And if the church leaders didn't know about any of the Danites' actions, it's because, and again, I'm going to impose maybe a little bit of conjecture, it's because they either asked the Danites to not tell them so that they wouldn't be implicit. Or what I think is most likely is that they actually did have some type of setup for the Danites to report back to church leadership and let them know what they had done. But at the very minimum, to recognize that church leaders did organize them and were involved and knew what their goal and mission was.
I'll read this last paragraph of this section. As a result of their experience in Missouri, the Latter-day Saints created a large state-sanctioned militia, the Nauvoo Legion, to protect themselves after they moved to Illinois. This militia was feared by many who saw the Latter-day Saints as enemies. But the Legion avoided offensive and retaliatory action. It did not respond even in the crisis leading up to the mob murders of Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram in June 1844, or in the aftermath of those murders. When the governor of Illinois ordered that the Legion disband, the Saints followed the instruction. Anthony, any thoughts on that last little paragraph there?
No, I would mention that Michael isn't a believing member anymore, but he was at one point. But he has some absolutely very, very important work, and he's a very important historian in Mormon history. I just, again, with regard to these the Nauvoo experience, I again recommend Ben Park's book, The Kingdom of Nauvoo, because it just provides so much more context of what happened during that time.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's important. I'm going to read really quick D&C 135, verse 7, which is John Taylor's account of what happened in Carthage jail. So this is what D&C 135, verse 7 says. They were innocent, they being Hiram and Joseph. They were innocent of any crime, as they had often been proved before, and were only confined in jail by the conspiracy of traitors and wicked men, and their innocent blood on the floor of Carthage jail is a broad seal affixed to Mormonism that cannot be rejected by any court on earth. And their innocent blood on the, oh my goodness, escutcheon of the state of Illinois, I butchered that, I promise, with the broken faith of the state as pledged by the governor, is a witness to the truth of the everlasting gospel that all the world cannot impeach. And their innocent blood on the banner of liberty and on the Magna Charta of the United States is an ambassador for the religion of Jesus Christ that will touch the hearts of honest men among all nations, and their innocent blood, with the innocent blood of all the martyrs under the bolter of John saw, will cry unto the Lord of hosts till he avenges that blood on the earth. Amen. So the reason why I wanted to read that real quick is that, it starts out with the sentence of they were innocent of any crime. Look, there's no justification. There's not a justification for the mob violence that occurred and kill them. This is not an excuse to kill Joseph and Hiram, but they were not innocent of any crime. They did destroy the Nauvoo expositor. They did break the law. They were in jail because of that. So, this persecution complex it's canonized. It's right here within the Doctrine and Covenants. Even bringing in the United States, and this innocent blood will cry unto the Lord host till he avenges that blood on the earth. So it's setting up this next period and this next attitude within the LDS story that goes over to Utah, that this vengeance is kind of in their hearts, right there in the scriptures. All right, let's move into the violence in Utah territory section. Let's see, Anthony, could you read that?
Sure. Violence in Utah territory. In Utah, aggression or retaliation by Latter-day Saints against their perceived enemies occurred most frequently during the first decade of settlement between 1847 and 1857. For many years, the scars of former persecutions and the trek to the Rocky Mountains were still fresh and personal. As they tried to carve out a living in the Utah desert, the Saints faced continuing conflict. Many factors worked against the success of the Latter-day Saint venture in Utah: tensions with American Indians who had been displaced by Mormon settlement and expansion, pressure from the U.S. federal government, particularly after the public announcement of plural marriage in 1852, uncertain land claims, and rapidly expanding population. Community leaders felt an unrelenting burden of responsibility, not only for the spiritual welfare of the church, but also the physical survival of their people. Many of these leaders, including church president and territorial governor Brigham Young, simultaneously held ecclesiastical and civil offices. Man, there's a lot to unpack in that. But I would just say they explained to a certain extent, or they alluded to, that they took land from American Indians. That well, I guess in the next paragraph, they're going to talk about the displacement of American Indians and so forth. But it doesn't mention the Reformation period as well. I mean, there was all sorts of violence going on. In 1852, Brigham Young and the legislature established Utah as an official slave territory. So there was slavery stuff going on. There was members of the Saints coming into the Salt Lake Valley with their slaves. That contributed to kind of the contention of what was going on in the U.S. Utah was the only Western territory that was a legal slave territory. There were all sorts of kinds of things going on. And to understand the context of the Saints as well, there was a fair amount of paranoia as well, because they believed that they were justified in the violence that they committed in Missouri and in Illinois, and that they escaped to Utah. They felt justified by God, but they were very anti-American at that point. Again, the Council of 50 was about overthrowing the U.S. government and replacing the U.S. Constitution with a theocracy. Those kinds of things continue to go on. And in addition to the other things that we've shared, that gives you kind of an underlying understanding of the context of what was happening in Utah. It was an extremely violent time.
Bill, could you read the next two paragraphs and then give your thoughts?
Where are we starting here? Is this
we are at Latter-day Saints' relationship with American Indians.
Yeah. So Latter-day Saints' relationship with American Indians. Like other settlers in frontier areas, Latter-day Saints occupied areas already inhabited by American Indians. The tragic history of annihilation of many Indian tribes and devastation of others at the hands of European immigrant settlers and United States military and political apparatus has been well documented by historians. Settlers throughout the 19th century, including some Latter-day Saints, mistreated and killed Indians in numerous conflicts, forcing them off desirable lands and onto reservations. Unlike most other Americans, Latter-day Saints viewed Indians as a chosen people. I can't wait till we get to the end here and I can share a few thoughts, because again, that rhetoric says like, oh, we love the Indians. We treated them so nicely. We hold them in high regard, right? They're the Lamanites. They're the sacred people of the Book of Mormon. And the reality is, man, we were really harsh to the Indians. Fellow Israelites who were descendants of the Book of Mormon peoples and thus heirs to God's promises. As church president, territorial governor, and territorial superintendent of Indian affairs, Brigham Young pursued a peace policy to facilitate Mormon settlement in areas where Indians lived. Latter-day Saints learned Indian languages, established trade relations. By the way, I'm curious why the church doesn't use Native Americans or a more appropriate word to describe rather than Indians. That word on its own kind of has some issues. Established trade relations, preached the gospel, and generally sought accommodation with Indians. This policy, however, emerged unevenly and was inconsistently applied.
Okay, let's stop there then.
Okay. Stop
there and you go ahead and unpack some of that.
Yeah, so just a couple of thoughts. There's a lot that's going on. So I want to share just really quickly 5 events. Some of these involved Native Americans, some involve something else. So the first one is 1851, Skull Valley. In an attempt to find horse thieves, Captain Porter Rockwell came upon a tribe of Utes. He took them prisoner, but after determining they didn't know anything about the horse thieves, he executed them. There's an event called the Circleville Massacre. On April 21st, 1866, the people of Circleville were told to protect themselves against the Native Americans who were camped in their valley. Upon receipt of this information, the people of Circleville called a town meeting. After much discussion, it was decided that they should arrest the Paiutes that were camped nearby and bring them to Circleville for confinement. Every able-bodied man in the town set out to take custody of the Native American camp, and they surrounded the camp at night. They attempted to trick the natives by asking them to all come listen to a letter read. All of the Native Americans agreed willingly to go to Circleville with the men except for one young Native American warrior who refused to go and began to shoot at the posse. The posse returned fire, killing the young man. The rest of the Native Americans were taken at gunpoint to Circleville, and the letter was read to them. The Native Americans were then told that they were to be retained as prisoners. So they kept their end of the deal. They read the letter, but then essentially detained these Native Americans as prisoners. The Indians were taken into custody and placed in the meeting house that night under guard. The captured Native Americans, 26 in all, displayed much unrest. On the evening of the following day, some of them were able to cut themselves loose in their bindings to escape. Upon discovering this, guards shot and killed 2 of them who were attempting to escape. The remaining imprisoned Native Americans were moved to an underground cellar. In a subsequent town meeting, the settlers decided to kill the remaining imprisoned Native Americans. The Indians, and of course, this is their words from the quote of the Wikipedia page, I believe. The Indians were let out of the cellar, totaling 24, including men, women, and children. They were struck on the back of the head to stun them, and then their throats were slit, leaving them to bleed to death. Battle at Fort Utah. After the Tippanegos defended themselves from their village and abandoned cabin, they fled their camp. The Mormons pursued the Tippanegos from Chief Old Elk's tribe and any other Tippanegos they found in the valley, killing them from Chief Old Elk's tribe and other tribes, even if they had no history of attacking the Mormons. The Nauvoo Legion killed around 100 Tippanegos, Native Americans. Battle Creek Massacre. There were 4 to 7 Native Americans killed. The first battle between Mormon settlers in Utah and the Tippanegos natives who lived there occurred at Battle Creek, Utah. The sleeping natives were outnumbered and outgunned and had no defense against the Deseret militia that crept in and surrounded their camp before dawn on March 5th, 1849. The Mormon settlement of Utah Valley came upon the hills of the attack at Battle Creek. And then there's other violence too. It's probably a good place just to insert this. There's other violence too. The Parish Potter murders is one of those where there's some threats made by a Mormon community against a faithful member at the time who is suspected of some things, and so they have the intent to kill him. He runs to his uncle's house. He's followed to his uncle's house. This is where 3 people are killed, him and 2 people that were with him. And the criminal goes unpunished due to the organized efforts of the local Mormon community. There was a cover-up there, and so it's kind of an interesting story. I think there's a dialogue article written that covers all of the data there. And I think, too, just should be pointed out, too, as we share all of this information, I think in the final episode, in the source or in the episode notes, we'll probably share our outline with all of our hyperlinks so that people can find all of this data, because you can't go through it all in just a matter of a couple of hours. But tons of violence actually occurring. And again, this rhetoric gave members and local leaders what they felt was permission to carry out retribution and justice as they saw fit.
Yeah, with the Circleville Massacre, like they took men, women, and children to a church building and contained them there, and then subsequently moved them to a cellar, like you read, hit them on the back of a head with a rock to stun them, and then sliced their throats, and then the next Sunday they probably went to church and had the sacrament, and there was no consequence for those kinds of things. That was the kind of thing that was going on. So just definitely not part of the dominant narrative of the history of the church in Utah.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff and it's hard to learn about. It's terrible. It's really, really difficult to learn about. And Bill, I mean, you mentioned, and looking at the time that we're at now, we haven't even gotten to the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and there's so much that you can learn about here. So yes, we'll include that in the show notes. I'll keep reading here if that's all right. So peaceful accommodations between Latter-day Saints and Indians was both the norm and the ideal. At times, however, church members clashed violently with Indians. These 2 cultures, European and American Indian, had vastly different assumptions about the use of land and property and did not understand each other well. Mormons often accuse Indians of stealing. Indians, meanwhile, believed the Mormons had a responsibility to share goods and livestock raised on Indian tribal lands. In areas where Mormons settled, Indian experience with Europeans had previously consisted mostly of mutually beneficial interactions with trappers and traders, people who passed through the land or briefly dwelled on it, not staked permanent claim to it as the Mormons did. These misunderstandings led to friction and violence between the peoples. I'll read the next paragraph as well. In late 1849, tensions between Ute Indians and Mormons in Utah Valley escalated after a Mormon killed a Ute known as Old Bishop, whom he accused of stealing his shirt. The Mormon and 2 associates then hid the victim's body in the Provo River. Details of the murder were likely withheld, at least initially, from Brigham Young and other church leaders. Settlers at Fort Utah did, however, report other difficulties with the Indians, including the firing of weapons at settlers and the theft of livestock and crops. Brigham Young counseled patients, telling them to, quote, stockade your fort to attend to your own affairs and let the Indians take care of theirs, end quote. Nevertheless, tensions mounted at Fort Utah, in part because local Mormons refused to turn over those involved in the murder of Old Bishop to the Utes or to pay reparations for his death. In the winter of 1849 and 1850, a measles epidemic spread from the Mormon settlers to the Ute camps, killing many Indians and heightening tensions. At a council of church leaders in Salt Lake City on January 31st, 1850, the leader of Fort Utah reported that the Utes' actions and intentions were growing increasingly aggressive. Quote, they say they mean to hunt our cattle and go and get the other Indians to kill us, end quote. In response, Governor Young authorized a campaign against the Utes. A series of battles in February 1850 resulted in the deaths of dozens of Utes and 1 Mormon. In these instances and others, some Latter-day Saints committed excessive violence against Native peoples. We're just about done with this section, so I'll finish it off. Nevertheless, for the most part, the Saints had more amicable relations with Indians than did settlers in other areas of the American West. How is that quantified? Sorry, that's not in the essay. Brigham Young enjoyed friendships with several American Indian leaders and taught his people to live peacefully with their Indian neighbors whenever possible. Some Indians even distinguished between Mormonese, whom they considered friendly, and other American settlers who were known as Maricats. And that is the end of the section. They get really detailed here. They actually provide quite a few details regarding some tensions with the Utes that led to some aggressive acts on both sides, it looks like. Anything worth calling out there other than some of this language that kind of gives the reader permission to kind of find the actions of Brigham not excusable but justified. Anything else to add there before we go on to the next section?
So I'd add one thing. I mentioned even though this essay isn't about slavery, the history of slavery in Utah included more ownership or servanthood kind of thing of Native Americans than it did African Americans. And that would have contributed to some of the tensions as well, because Native American children were, in many cases, owned by some of the Latter-day Saints.
Okay, thank you. Bill, can you read? I know, forget you. Anthony.
Sure. The Reformation.
You haven't read a bit, yeah.
This is such an interesting period. The Reformation and the Utah War. In the mid-1850s, a Reformation within the church. I'm going to break for a second here. So the story behind this is Brigham Young couldn't understand why the second coming hadn't come yet, and he determined that it was because of the wickedness of the saints. And so that's what brought about the Reformation period. So with that context, I'll continue. So in the mid-1850s, a Reformation within the church and tensions between, and I'd also mention, that as part of the Reformation, all the saints got rebaptized too. So Brigham wanted the saints to be obedient. He sent out, people to do probably a much more stringent version of a temple recommend type of interview, like house to house among the saints. He had them all rebaptized. He felt like this is what needed to happen, and that the reason the second coming had happened is because the saints were righteous. All right. So in the mid-1850s, a Reformation within the church and tensions between the Latter-day Saints in Utah and the U.S. federal government contributed to a siege mentality and a renewed sense of persecution that led to several episodes of violence committed by church members. Concerned about spiritual complacency, Brigham Young and other church leaders derived a series of sermons in which they called the saints to repent and renew their spiritual commitments. Many testified that they became better people because of this Reformation. 19th century Americans were accustomed to violent language, both religious and otherwise. Throughout the century, revivalists had used violent imagery to encourage the unconverted to repent and to urge backsliders to reform. At times during the Reformation, President Young, his counselor Jedediah M. Grant, and other leaders preached with fiery rhetoric, warning against the evils of those who dissented from or opposed the church. Drawing on biblical passages, particularly from the Old Testament, leaders taught that some sins were so serious that a perpetrator's blood would have to be shed in order to receive forgiveness, and we've alluded to some of those in this episode. Such preaching led to increased strain between the Latter-day Saints and the relatively few non-Mormons in Utah, including federally appointed officials. In early 1857, U.S. President James Buchanan received reports from some of the federal officials alleging that Governor Young and the Latter-day Saints in Utah were rebelling against the authority of the federal government. A strongly worded memorial from the Utah legislature to the federal government convinced federal officials the reports were true. President Buchanan decided to replace Brigham Young as governor, and in what became known as the Utah War, sent an army to Utah to escort his replacement. Latter-day Saints feared that the oncoming army, some 1,500 troops with more to follow, would renew the depredations of Missouri and Illinois and again drive the Saints from their homes. In addition, Parley P. Pratt, a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, was murdered in Arkansas in May 1857. News of the murder, as well as newspaper reports from the eastern United States that celebrated the crime, reached Utah in June of 1857. As these events unfolded, Brigham Young declared martial law in the territory, directed missionaries and settlers in outlying areas to return to Utah, and guided preparations to resist the army. Defiant sermons given by President Young and other church leaders, combined with the impending arrival of the army, helped create an environment of fear and suspicion in Utah. Was Parley, I didn't look this up before this episode, was Parley P. Pratt the one that was killed by the husband of a polygamous wife that he took on?
Yeah,
that's correct. That's correct.
Yeah. I wonder why they omitted that from that paragraph.
Yeah, they didn't quite explain it. And again, doesn't justify a murder, right?
No, but polygamy was a significant part of what was going on. And Parley P. Pratt was killed by a jealous husband, not because he was Mormon, but because he took this guy's wife as a plural wife. So, and then he got killed. So,
right. And he was Parley, and again, I don't have the notes on all the details, but it was not far outside of the courthouse where Parley was actually being charged with. And again, I don't want to name what he was charged with because I don't have the notes in front of me. But there's, yeah, some of these important details are not mentioned. Anything else on this particular section? I know, Bill, you have a few notes here.
Just it was just pointing back to the Parrish Potter murders again, and again some of the other violence that's happened. It's interesting that sometimes the church chooses to share these tangent pieces of information and data, like they used to call the Mormonese, and then there was the whatever the other name was for the other guys. And then also other times crucial parts of information seem to be left out, which would lead the reader to a more negative reaction. I just find that interesting.
Yep, absolutely. All right, we made it. We made it to the
Mountain
Meadows Massacre.
Yeah,
Bill, can you read the first couple paragraphs here?
At the peak of this tension in early September 1857, a branch of the territorial militia in southern Utah, composed entirely of Mormons, along with some Indians they recruited, laid siege to a wagon train of immigrants traveling from Arkansas to California. As the wagon train traveled south from Salt Lake City, the immigrants had clashed verbally with local Mormons over where they could graze their cattle. Some of the members of the wagon train became frustrated because they had difficulty purchasing much-needed grain and other supplies from local settlers who had been instructed to save their grain as a wartime policy. Aggrieved, some of the immigrants threatened to join incoming troops in fighting against the Saints. Although some Saints ignored these threats, other local church leaders and members in Cedar City, Utah, advocated violence. Isaac C. Haight, a stake president and militia leader, sent John D. Lee, a militia major, to lead an attack on an immigrant company. While the president reported the plan to his council, other leaders objected and requested that he call off the attack and instead send an express rider to Brigham Young in Salt Lake City for guidance. But the men Haight had sent to attack the immigrants carried out their plans before they received the order not to attack. The immigrants fought back. and the siege ensued. Over the next few days, events escalated, and Mormon militiamen planned and carried out a deliberate massacre. They lured the immigrants from their circled wagons with a false flag of truce, and aided by Paiute Indians they had recruited, slaughtered them. Between the first attack and the final slaughter, the massacre destroyed the lives of 120 men, women, and children in the valley known as Mountain Meadows. Only small children, those believed to be too young to be able to tell what happened, were spared. The express rider returned 2 days after the massacre. He carried a letter from Brigham Young telling local leaders not to meddle with the immigrants and to allow them to pass through southern Utah. The militiamen sought to cover up the crime by placing the entire blame on local Paiutes, some of whom were also members of the church. 2 Latter-day Saints were eventually excommunicated from the church for their participation, and a grand jury that included Latter-day Saints indicted 9 men. Only one participant, John D. Lee, was convicted and executed for the crime, which fueled false allegations that the massacre had been ordered by Brigham Young.
So,
And
Bill,
yeah,
let's stop there. Why would John D. Lee's involvement fuel false allegations?
So John D. Lee was adopted as a son of Brigham Young, so that should be noted. Somebody has to be the fall guy. There's so much going on here. I want to kind of go back up to the top, and hopefully we've got enough time to get through this section. There's the sentence, because they had difficulty purchasing much needed grain and other supplies from local settlers, they were boxed out. And by that, what I mean was that here you have these people traveling across the country trying to find a home, and they're getting low on supplies. They need things. Otherwise, they will starve to death. And here we have Latter-day Saints telling them, no, you can't eat on my land. You can't eat Mormon grass. You can't have your animals partaking of nourishment and food from any of our areas, which is everything. So they don't have access to feed their animals. They're asking for food for the people, and the Saints are saying, nope, you can't have our grain. You can't have any of our supplies. And so they're essentially stuck. It talks about them fighting against the Saints. You can see that the author is dead set on wording this in a way that gives as much charity to the church and to the members, and to paint all non-members as being the more serious culprits in these disagreements. These people were pretty peaceful. And as you can imagine, if you're low on food and you have a long ways to go yet, you need some help. And if you're not getting help, which seems like common human decency, frustrations are certainly going to rise. John M. Higbee, who gave the orders to kill the Arkansas members of the mountain that was involved here, that mountain members, recalled in 1896 that Cedar City was in the grip of a craze of fanaticism stronger than he would be willing to now admit. He says stronger than we would be willing now to admit. In other words, they were just amped up on this violent rhetoric. A couple other things here. They killed all the witnesses, right? They only left alive the children who could not testify to what had happened. So it is a cover-up. They killed all the witnesses. John D. Lee wrote about the victims of the massacre. This lot of people had men amongst them that were supposed to have helped kill the prophets in the Carthage jail. Such a nonsense story, right? These people were from Arkansas, and yet to convince themselves that this violence was okay, they self-create a story that these have to be the members of the mob at Carthage. It's so absurd to justify things in this way. And then we get into the data of the massacre itself. 1859, Major James H. Carleton, U.S. Army and Cavalry arrived at Mountain Meadows with orders to bury the bones of the massacre victims. After searching the area, the remains of 34 victims were found and buried on the northern side of a ditch. This ditch was a defensive trench dug by the immigrants to protect themselves from their attackers. Around and above this grave, a rude monument was built of loose granite stones, creating a cairn, or a sepulcher. It was conical in form, 50 feet in circumference at the base, 12 feet in height, supported by a cross hewn from red cedar wood. From the ground to the top of the cross was 24 feet. So this was a tall cross that was built by the U.S. Army and Cavalry in memorial of them. On the traverse side of the cross, facing towards the north, was an inscription carved in the wood, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." It should be noted, this is to me was the greatest thing I discovered as I studied for this. In 1861, President Young is present for and authorizes the desecration of this grave and adds his own marker. 1864, let me get it here. 1864, the grave is repaired. Captain George F. Price and company of cavalry found the 1859 memorial and grave had been desecrated. The monument had been torn down, the cross taken away, and stones forming the monument scattered on the valley floor, while the mass grave underneath had been defaced. Captain Price and the cavalry immediately proceeded to repair the grave and rebuild the monument. The structure erected was of stone, creating a new cairn, measuring 12 feet square at the base and 4 feet high, compactly filled with loose stone and earth. Talks a little bit more about that. They can read the notes. Listeners can read the notes when they go there. On the side of the cross facing east were inscribed the words, "Vengeance is mine and I will repay, saith the Lord." Mountain Meadows, September 1857. Again, bear with me here, was just digging around in the Journal of Discourses, Volume 10, pages 104 through 111. Sadly, this was written in 1863. By this point, Brigham knew full well who was responsible for the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So what we learn there is this is Brigham talking, or at least his scribes. In 1857, it is estimated that 11,000 troops were ordered here. Some 7,000 started for this place with several thousand hangers on. They came into the territory when a company of immigrants were traveling the south route to California. Nearly all of that company were destroyed by the Indians. This is Brigham Young placing blame in 1863. Once he knows who did it, still placing blame on the Indians as an attempt to keep members who are naive as well as outsiders naive that it was actually the Mormons who took charge of this. That unfortunate affair had been laid to the charge of the whites. That's Brigham Young saying, like, we got blamed, but it really wasn't us. I pledged him that the court should be protected from any violence or hindrance in the prosecution of the laws, and if any were guilty of the blood of those who suffered at Mountain Meadows Massacre. And then this little gem, he says, "Shall I tell you the law of God in regard to the African race? If a white man who belongs to the chosen seed mixes his blood with the seed of Cain, and the penalty under the law of God is death on the spot, this will also be so." So that was another little add-on in that section. Brigham Young said, "We have the meanest devils of earth in our midst, and we intend to keep them, for we have use of them. And if the devil does not look sharp, we will cheat him out of them at the last, for they will reform and go to heaven with us." There was one more quote I wanted to read before we talk a little more about, and it was about the desecration. I'm not seeing it here, but Brigham Young this is in Wilford Woodruff's journals, by the way, and there's only 400 copies of those journals that exist. In Wilford Woodruff's journals, Wilford Woodruff says, "Look, Brigham Young was here standing with us. We were at the Mountain Meadows Massacre memorial that the cavalry had set up, and Brigham ordered us to destroy it." There's also a second witness to that, by the way, too. And again, I don't have the name handy here, but the second witness was a lady, and in her journal, a member of the church, she also says that Brigham Young ordered us to destroy the memorial. I mean, here are these innocent people who were killed. Here's Brigham Young, absolutely no ifs, ands, or buts involved in the cover-up, blaming the Indians decade after. Or at least half a decade after. And you also have Brigham Young ordering the saints to destroy this memorial. It is pretty harsh. And I think we have to come to grips with the kind of guy that Brigham Young was. And we have to stop painting our leaders, and I say our because I still consider myself to some degree Mormon. We have to stop painting our leaders as these righteous men. The reality is they are just as much of a mixed bag as the rest of human society.
Thanks for all of that, Bill. Anthony, go ahead.
Yeah, so I had mentioned there's been a number of books written about, and the next paragraph is going to refer to a book written by LDS apologists and historians. But there's been a number of books written about Mountain Meadows. One of the most significant ones is by author-historian Will Bagley. In 2002, the book Blood of the Prophets won all sorts of historical awards from the John Whitmer Historical Association and other awards. And even by 2013, many years later, the Western Writers of America picked Blood of the Prophets as the 6th best nonfiction book in the last 60 years. That's how significant it is. So Will Bagley's book about Mountain Meadows and dealing with this topic with Blood of the Prophets, and people should know when they read that, Will is a critic of the church. It was responded to in 2008 with what's in the next paragraph. Do you want me to read that paragraph?
Yeah, go ahead. I think I can say what I would like to about Mountain Meadows after that.
Okay. In recent years, the church has made diligent efforts to learn everything possible about the massacre. In the early 2000s, historians in the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints scoured archives throughout the United States for historical records. Every church record on the massacre was also open to scrutiny. In the resulting book, published by Oxford University Press in 2008, this is the more apologetic book that I was referring to, authors Ronald W. Walker, Richard E. Turley Jr., and Glenn M. Leonard concluded that while intemperate preaching about outsiders by Brigham Young, George A. Smith, and other leaders contributed to a climate of hostility, President Young did not order the massacre. Rather, verbal confrontations between individuals in the wagon train and southern Utah settlers created great alarm, particularly within the context of the Utah War and other adversarial events. A series of tragic decisions by local leaders who also held key civic and militia leadership roles in southern Utah led to the massacre. And that goes to what you were saying. Whether or not Brigham called for it to happen, there was a climate of hostility. He was part of it, and he was definitely involved, as Bill mentioned, in the cover-up and even the desecration of the memorial that was created.
Yeah, it absolutely was. I read that book by Will Bagley, and one of the striking things is a lot of the focus obviously is on the violence, and rightfully so, but the essay mentions that the kids that were spared, the young enough kids that were spared, and some of the tragic details of those kids is they were given to families, LDS Mormon families in the area, many of those who participated in the killings. And a few years afterwards, the U.S. government came and said, you need to give these kids back. The word had gotten out that these kids were being placed. It was in the number of between 1 and 2 dozen, I believe, children, that these kids had been placed in different Mormon households. And the cover-up was already on. They were already denying that this was all the Indians. This was not us. So the government came and said, we're going to bring these. There's families in Arkansas and Missouri that are saying we want these kids back. And what the Mormon families did is said, okay, well, here they are, but you need to pay us because we've been taking care of them. It wasn't us that killed them; it was the Indians. We've been taking care of them. So give us money for these past few years of taking care of these kids. I mean, it's awful, horrific type of behavior of you killed their family and now you're extorting the government to give you money. It's just awful. It's just awful.
It gets worse than that, Allan, which is that not only are you placing that, so first off, these kids see their parents killed, massacred, horrendous, violent deaths. Again, without going into a ton of the details, you have the Mormons and the Native Americans standing side by side with the men, one walking next to each one of these Arkansas folks traveling. And when the battle cry is given, each one of these men take out a gun and just shoot right into the head of the person next to them, killing them. Then they massacred the women and the older children, killing them. When these children are placed into the homes of the people who killed their parents, they also took the Mormon violators took the clothes of the people they had killed and given them to people in the town, including the people that these children were placed with. So some of these kids saw their mother's dress on the person who killed their family. Some of these kids saw the violator in their father's pants and shirt who had killed their father. What was done here is one of the most inhumane acts in all of American history when you consider the full scope and breadth of what had occurred. And again, we can't just lay this at the feet of John D. Lee, and we can't just lay this at the feet of 5 or 6 people, and we sure as hell can't lay it at the feet of the Native Americans. This is the Mormonism of the 1850s. And this is the rhetoric that was present that allowed people to feel justification in doing some of the most horrendous acts that I've ever read about. To me, it's insane, all the data and details that go into this.
Yeah. As we move, I mean, this is a sobering topic, and we're just about to the conclusion here. I've got a few minutes if you guys do to round this off.
Sure.
It's just about to move beyond the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and I just want to tie this personally to my ancestor. I think many of us can. It's not fully known exactly who participated and who didn't. One of my ancestors was. Some historians think he was there, other historians don't. But I've read his biography, and one thing that is for sure mentioned is that just a number of days after the massacre occurred, that he accompanied John D. Lee from southern Utah up to Salt Lake to give a report to Brigham Young, that he was the one that accompanied John D. Lee. And he talks about that in the biography and journals that I've read of my ancestor. Elisha Groves is his name. And I mean, that's telling. It's telling. The essay mentions that a letter finally arrived from Brigham a couple days after the massacre not to meddle, which leads me to think, why was an order of nonviolence needed if violence wasn't the default? Why did he have to tell them not to meddle if that should have been the default? But my ancestor was right there alongside, was not permitted to enter the room when they arrived, but John D. Lee, just within a few weeks of the massacre, was there telling Brigham and giving his report, and then we see this cover-up happen. Okay, so
just a quick note too.
Yeah, go ahead.
The cover-up goes far and wide. Jacob Hamlin, who we all say like, oh, Jacob wouldn't have been part of this. He was heading the other direction. He met the settlers a day or two before they got to southern Utah and where the Mountain Meadows Massacre occurred. And people say if Jacob had just been in town, he would have stopped this from happening. It ought to be noted that Jacob Hamlin also blamed the Native Americans even after knowing what really happened. He claimed that the Native Americans were to blame, that even though all those murdered were shot with guns, and he knew, because he was the mediator between the LDS membership and the Native Americans in the area, by the way. There's a home down here that celebrates Jacob Hamlin's life. It's his home. There's still missionaries there, senior missionaries who give tours at the home. He knew that the Paiutes only had 3 guns among their tribe, that it was impossible for them to have been responsible for this carnage. But he also helped in the cover-up. So I think that should be noted as well.
Absolutely. This last paragraph before the conclusion. Aside from the Mountain Meadows Massacre, a few Latter-day Saints committed other violent acts against a small number of dissenters and outsiders. Some Latter-day Saints perpetuated acts of extra-legal violence, especially in the 1850s, when fear and tensions were prevalent in Utah territory. The heated rhetoric of church leaders directed toward dissenters may have led these Mormons to believe that such actions were justified. The perpetrators of these crimes were generally not punished. Even so, many allegations of such violence are unfounded, and anti-Mormon writers have blamed church leaders for many unsolved crimes or suspicious deaths in early Utah. Do we want to point out any language there or move on to the conclusion? Let's move on to the conclusion.
Sounds good.
So,
yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack. There are books that people can read. They can go to the Wikipedia page on Mormonism and violence and follow the cited sources. And there's a lot in the footnotes of this essay also.
Yeah, the devil's in the footnotes. We'll say that. Absolutely read the footnotes and the sources that they quote. So conclusion, many people in the 19th century unjustly characterized the Latter-day Saints as a violent people. Yet the vast majority of Latter-day Saints in the 19th century, as today, lived in peace with their neighbors and families and sought peace in their communities. Travelers in the 19th century often noted the peace and order that prevailed in Mormon communities in Utah and elsewhere. Nevertheless, the actions of relatively few Latter-day Saints caused death and injury, frayed community relationships, and damaged the perceptions of Mormons as a peaceful people. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints condemns violent words and actions and affirms its commitment to furthering peace throughout the world. Speaking of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, Elder Henry B. Eyring, then a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, stated, The quote, "The gospel of Jesus Christ that we espouse abhors the cold-blooded killing of men, women, and children. Indeed, it advocates peace and forgiveness. What was done here long ago by members of our church represents a terrible and inexcusable departure from Christian teaching and conduct." End quote. Throughout the church's history, church leaders have taught that the way of Christian discipleship is a path of peace. Elder Russell M. Nelson of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles connected the Latter-day Saints' faith in Jesus Christ to their active pursuit of love of neighbor and peace with all people. Quote, "The hope of the world is the Prince of Peace. Now, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, what does the Lord expect of us? As a church, we must renounce war and proclaim peace. As individuals, we should follow after the things which make for peace. We should be personal peacemakers," end quote. And then it ends with, "The church acknowledges the contribution of scholars to the historical content presented in this article. Their work is used with permission." Originally published May 2014. Okay, let's unpack this last one and bring it home.
Let me jump in here. So there's other little cases. The murder of Isaac Whitehouse. He was a kid that was abused by his stepfather. Nobody in the town stopped it. It was a Mormon community. Nobody stopped it. After it had happened, there was an effort to not have the guy serve a severe sentence that came from church leadership. We have Bishop Warren Snow's castration of a young man who pursued the affection of a young woman that Bishop Snow had his eyes on. We have the Whistling Whittlers, who we like to say were these Aaronic priesthood holders, which we now are, again, how we shape the narrative. We impose and imply through our rhetoric that these were just Aaronic priesthood holders, meaning 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds who just carved pieces of wood and whistled down the street to scare people. The reality is that Aaronic priesthood holders in this day were not kids. They were adults. The knives were not little pocket knives. They were Bowie knives. And they were also part of the Danites. And they threatened people that Brigham Young and other leaders wanted to chase out of town. William Marks himself left town scared to death, and Brigham Young made comment that the Whistling Whittlers were not necessary to get Thomas Marks or William Marks to leave town. And I want to just end by saying that the church wants to say, like, oh, that's in our past and we don't do violence today. I mentioned Boyd K. Packer earlier. And there's also a huge degree of spiritual violence in our rhetoric today still being shared about those who leave the church, those who leave their testimony, about the wicked world and those in it. We have a rhetoric of spiritual violence against those who no longer believe or have never believed in ways that I think call for a collective cultural repentance. We can't just say that's a thing of our past. We are still committing violence of one sort or another today and damaging relationships and hurting people unnecessarily by painting people who lose belief in the church as somehow broken, less than, and as somehow in cahoots with the devil. And we've got to make amends for that, and something has to change.
Yeah, so I would say, of a believing member who studies this kind of material, my sense is where people get their faith challenged is that this is very different than the dominant narratives that we received, and so there is this sometimes a sense of betrayal that we had polished narratives, and so forth. But I think when we study history, all history is really messy. Like the Revolutionary War is very messy, the Civil War is very messy, and so forth. And I think we just need to stop polishing narratives and talk about things that really happened. And but like Bill is alluding to, our scriptures and some of our other things are still filled with violence. There's still those passages in the Book of Mormon about the righteous Gentiles uniting with the Lamanites and violently overthrowing the wicked Gentiles. So in any event, this was a very important essay for me. It wasn't the thing that crashed my shelves. My shelves were crashed with the Race and the Priesthood essay, but this was a very sobering essay for me to read personally.
Bill, Anthony, thank you both for your thoughts, your research, your wisdom, all the superlatives I throw to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us, everybody that is listening in on this, probably the most sobering as to date, Gospel Topics Essay Exploration and Recitation. we are very happy that you have been patient with us, and we won't let this much time pass in between episodes again as we move forward to complete this project to review and give further context to the Gospel Topics essays. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.